The richest man in Whispering Pines was about to make the deadliest mistake of his life. And it began with a cup of coffee and an act of kindness that would unravel 30 years of buried secrets. Thadwick Ormsby pulled his Stetson low, a futile gesture against a wind that carried knives. He pushed through the swinging doors of Clevenger's saloon, and the blizzard chasing him howled in frustration. The Montana town was a ghost, buried in white, but inside this saloon, a different kind of cold had settled deep into the bones of the place. It was a human cold, and it was coming from the young woman behind the bar. Her hair was the color of a new penny, pinned back in a hurry. Her calico dress was so thin he could almost see the winter through it. But it was her hands that stopped him. They trembled, a violent, uncontrollable shaking as she poured whiskey for a grumbling prospector. Her lips were blue, her eyes were hollowed out by exhaustion, but in their green depths, a fire still burned. Defiance. Between customers, she rubbed her arms, a desperate, useless motion. He watched as her numb fingers fumbled a glass. It hit the floorboards with a sound like a gunshot, shattering the drunken quiet. Across the room, the saloon's owner, Ewell Clevenger, bellowed, "God damn it, Roxana! That's the third glass tonight. Another one, and it comes from your pay." The woman, Roxana, didn't answer. She didn't even flinch. She just knelt, her movements slow and deliberate, and began to gather the glittering shards with those same trembling hands. There was a dignity in the set of her shoulders, something proud and unbroken that refused to bend, even as the cold tried to snap her in two. Thadwick had seen enough misery in his life to fill a canyon. He'd clawed his way up from nothing, surviving things that would have broken other men. 5 years ago, he'd struck silver on his ranch, a strike so pure it made him a king overnight. But watching this woman, he felt an old, familiar ache. He saw a survivor. He walked to the bar, his boots heavy on the floor. He reached into his sheepskin coat for the thick roll of bills he always carried. He was just going to help. Simple as that. Pay for the glass, give her enough to buy a coat, a warm meal, a simple act of kindness. He never expected her reaction. Roxana looked up, and her emerald eyes fixed on him, sharp as broken glass. Before a single word could leave his lips, she cut him down. Her voice was thin, raspy from the cold, but it carried an edge of pure steel that stunned him. "Whatever you're selling," she said, her voice low and fierce, "I ain't buying." Thadwick took a step back, genuinely thrown. The entire saloon was watching now. He could feel their eyes on his back. "I've seen your type before," she went on, her gaze never leaving his. "Rich men who stroll in here thinking their money buys them whatever they want, especially from a desperate woman." "Ma'am, I was just—" "Just what?" Her voice cracked, a fissure of cold and raw anger. "Offering charity? Or something else? You think because I'm freezing I've got no pride left? That I'll fall at your feet, grateful for whatever scraps you deign to offer?" Whispers erupted around them. "That's Ormsby," he heard someone mutter. "The Silver King." They recognized him, even in his plain clothes. Roxana saw the shift in the room, saw the way the patrons were looking at him, and her defiance flickered, replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. That's when Ewell Clevenger scurried over, a greasy smile plastered on his face that didn't come close to reaching his cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Ormsby, what an honor to have you in my humble establishment." He shot a venomous glare at Roxana. "You'll show proper respect to Mr. Ormsby, girl, or you'll find yourself out in that blizzard without even this roof over your head." Roxana's face went white. She was trapped, caught between a stranger she didn't trust and a boss who held her life in his hands. Thadwick was about to discover that in Whispering Pines, some kinds of help came with a price no fortune could ever pay, and Roxana Goolsby was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one trying to save you. Roxana had learned that lesson the hard way 3 years ago, in a town called Silverdale. It was a lesson written in scars you couldn't see. So when Thadwick Ormsby, the man who owned half of Whispering Pines, offered to buy her a coat, a hot meal, whatever she needed, every instinct she had screamed like a cornered animal. It was a trap. It was always a trap. What she couldn't figure out was the angle. Why would a man this powerful, a man who could buy and sell this entire town, even notice her? Clevenger's fawning behavior only made it worse, the way he suddenly treated her like a human being, but only because a rich man was paying attention. It was a familiar humiliation, a reminder that to men like Clevenger, she was just property. Thadwick seemed to sense her spiraling panic, but instead of backing off, he did something that threw her completely off balance. He took off his own coat. It was heavy sheepskin, lined with wool, radiating a warmth that felt like a forgotten dream. He moved to place it around her shoulders, the gesture so gentle, so protective, that for a split second, she almost let him. Then the memories of Silverdale hit her like a fist, and she jerked back as if he'd tried to burn her. The coat, his act of kindness, fell to the floor. It landed in a puddle of spilled whiskey and sawdust, the fine wool instantly soaking up the filth of the saloon. The entire room went dead silent. The piano player stopped mid-song, his hands hovering over the keys. You could have heard a snowflake land. This wasn't just a rejection anymore. This was an insult to the most powerful man in the territory. That's when Roxana made the move that would change everything. She bent down, her trembling fingers closing around the collar of the heavy coat. She stood up and held it out to him, her eyes locked on his. She spoke in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, but every single person in that saloon heard every word. "The last man who offered me help like yours," she said, her voice shaking with more than just the cold, "was in Silverdale. He said he'd marry me proper. I came west as his mail-order bride." She took a ragged breath. "Turned out his help meant selling my contract to the highest bidder the day I arrived." Her eyes blazed. "So you'll have to forgive me if I don't trust a stranger's kindness." Thadwick listened, and with every word she spoke, his expression grew darker. He took the coat from her, his gaze intense. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to convince her he was different. He just asked one simple question. "What would it take for you to believe my help comes with no strings attached?" Before Roxana could even think of an answer, the saloon doors slammed open with a crash, letting in a swirl of snow and frigid air. 3 men stepped inside, stamping their boots and shaking the blizzard from their coats. Roxana recognized them instantly, and the blood drained from her face. They worked for Judge Fans, the man who really ran Whispering Pines, the man who pulled every string from the shadows. They didn't go to the bar for a drink. They walked straight toward Thadwick and Roxana, their faces cold, their eyes like chips of ice. The one in the lead, a tall man with a jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, spoke directly to Thadwick. His voice was a low rumble. "Judge Fans heard about your newfound interest in Clevenger's employee," the scarred man said. "He wanted me to remind you that some business arrangements in this town are already set in stone. Certain debts are still being paid. Interference wouldn't be appreciated." Thadwick's entire demeanor shifted. The kind, concerned gentleman vanished. In his place stood someone harder, someone far more dangerous. His voice was quiet, but there was a core of iron beneath it. "Exactly what kind of debt are we talking about?" The scarred man smiled, a predatory curl of the lips that showed his teeth. He looked directly at Roxana, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "She knows exactly what kind," he answered. "The kind that can't be paid with money. The kind that requires other forms of compensation." Roxana's hands started shaking again, but this time it had nothing to do with the cold. She was an animal in a snare, and she'd just heard the hunter's footsteps getting closer. Thadwick took a half step forward, deliberately placing himself between her and the three men. It was a subtle move, but its meaning was unmistakable. Lines were being drawn in the sawdust of that saloon floor. What no one in that room knew was that Judge Fans was watching the entire scene from his office window across the snow-swept street. He took a slow sip of his brandy, a thin smile on his lips. Thadwick Ormsby, the untouchable Silver King, had just stepped into his web, and the judge had just decided to pull it tight. Some debts are written in blood, and Judge Fans was about to collect. Thadwick Ormsby had stared down rustlers in the dead of night. He'd survived shootouts over claim disputes and built an empire from dust and rock. But standing in that saloon, with the chilling fear in Roxana's eyes reflecting in his own, he knew he was walking into a fight far deadlier than any he'd ever known. This wasn't about land or silver. This was about souls. The scarred man, Silas, reached slowly into his coat. Thadwick's hand twitched, instinctively moving toward the Colt, holstered at his hip. But Silas didn't pull out a gun. He produced a piece of paper, yellowed with age, covered in official-looking stamps and seals. He unfolded it with a deliberate flourish, holding it up so everyone in the saloon could see it. It was a contract. Roxana's name was scrawled at the bottom, the handwriting shaky, forced. The signature looked like it had been signed under unimaginable duress. The document was a masterpiece of legal evil. It stated that one Roxana Goolsby owed Judge Fans the sum of $2,500 for legal services rendered. Interest, it noted, had been compounding daily for 3 years. Thadwick did the math in his head. At the predatory rates listed, she now owed over $2,000. It was a fortune. More money than she could hope to earn in 10 years of slinging whiskey in this hellhole. But that wasn't the worst part. Silas tapped a long, dirty fingernail on a clause near the bottom, the print so small it was barely legible. If the debt cannot be paid in currency, Silas read aloud, his voice dripping with satisfaction, it can be satisfied through alternative service arrangements, to be determined at the sole discretion of the creditor. Roxana's voice was a bare whisper. She told Thadwick that the judge had helped her when she first arrived in Whispering Pines, lost and desperate. She'd been running from something in her past, and she'd needed legal protection. Fans had promised to help her, pro bono, a generous act from the town's leading citizen. It was only after her signature was on the paper that she discovered the hidden costs. Thadwick felt a cold rage building in his gut, but he kept his voice steady. "I'll pay it," he said, his words cutting through the tense silence. Her debt. All of it. Right here, right now. He reached for his money roll, ready to end this nightmare. Silas's smile widened into a full-blown grin. "You're welcome to pay the financial portion of the debt, Mr. Ormsby." A generous offer. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But Miss Goolsby has already begun fulfilling the alternative service arrangements, and those, I'm afraid, are non-transferable." He leaned in closer. "Some contracts," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "require personal satisfaction." And in that moment, Thadwick understood. This wasn't just about one woman's debt. This was a system, a machine. Judge Fans was using the letter of the law to trap the most vulnerable people in his town, forcing them into a modern-day slavery they could never escape. And Roxana wasn't his only victim. Thadwick's eyes scanned the room. He saw it now, clear as day. The haunted look in the eyes of the other women working the saloon. The careful, precise way they moved, like people who knew exactly what happened if they dropped a glass, or said the wrong word, or looked the wrong man in the eye for too long. They were all caught in the same web. Clevenger, the saloon owner, had been watching, wringing his hands, sweat beading on his forehead. He stepped forward, his voice a pathetic whine. "I'm just following orders, Mr. Ormsby. I don't make the rules. Everyone in Whispering Pines. We all have to follow the judge's arrangements if we want to stay in business, if we want to stay safe. The corruption wasn't just one crooked judge. It was the foundation the entire town was built on. A foundation of fear and exploitation, with Judge Fans sitting at the center like a fat spider, feeling every vibration, every struggle. Silas folded the contract with a crisp snap and tucked it back into his coat. The judge appreciates your concern for the community's welfare, Mr. Ormsby. But some matters are best left to those who understand the delicate balance that keeps Whispering Pines so peaceful. The three men turned to leave, but at the door, Silas stopped and turned back. He delivered one final message, and the words were like ice water down Thadwick's spine. The judge looks forward to meeting with you personally. He'd like to discuss your future involvement in the business affairs of Whispering Pines. He smiled that dead-eyed smile again. Tonight, at the courthouse. Failure to appear will be considered an act of defiance against the established law of this territory. Thadwick watched them disappear into the swirling snow. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that everything he had built, everything he had worked and fought and bled for, was about to be put on the line. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the shivering woman standing beside him was hiding a secret. A secret that would make Judge Fans's threats, his contracts, and his entire corrupt empire seem like child's play. The snow kept falling, but inside Clevenger's saloon, the temperature had dropped to something far more dangerous than cold. After Judge Fans's men left, an unnatural quiet fell over the saloon. The remaining patrons drank with their heads down, refusing to look at Thadwick or Roxana, as if even witnessing the confrontation might drag them into the coming storm. Clevenger had retreated to the far end of the bar, scrubbing glasses that were already clean, his hands shaking. Thadwick turned to Roxana. He expected to see fear, maybe tears, maybe desperation. He saw none of that. Instead, he saw a woman studying him. Her eyes were narrowed with an intensity that was startling, as if she were a general sizing up a new weapon, trying to decide if he was reliable, if he was worth the monumental risk she was about to take. She moved closer, so close that her whisper was for his ears alone. "If you're really planning to meet with Judge Fans tonight," she said, her voice now steady and clear, "there are things you need to know, things that could get us both killed if the wrong person finds out I told you." She led him to a small, secluded table in the back corner, the one farthest from the bar and closest to the rear exit. As they sat, he noticed her hands had stopped shaking. The frightened, shivering victim from moments ago was gone. In her place was someone else entirely. Someone cold, calculating, and clearly several steps ahead of everyone in this town. "The judge's operation," she began, her voice low and urgent, "is much bigger than just trapping desperate women. The contracts, the debts, the alternative services. That's just the leverage. The real prize is land, mineral claims, water rights." She explained how Fans used his position as judge to systematically strip property from anyone who couldn't fight back. He'd find a small rancher with a sick wife and offer to cover the doctor's bills in exchange for a signature on a complicated loan document. He'd use the women he controlled to blackmail businessmen into selling their claims for pennies on the dollar. He was a cancer, and he had spread through the entire territory. "But here's the part you don't know," she said, her eyes boring into his. "I'm not just another one of his victims." She told him her real name was Verdella Corwin. 3 years ago, before she'd become the ghost named Roxana Goolsby, her father had been a territorial judge in Silverdale. A good man, an honest man, and she had grown up at his side, learning the law, learning exactly how corrupt men like Fans twisted it into a weapon. "My father found out about a similar corruption ring in Silverdale," she said, her voice tight with grief and rage. "He was getting close to exposing them. He had documents, evidence. He was found dead a week later. They called it a hunting accident." She'd barely escaped Silverdale with her life. The men who killed her father came for her next. But before she fled, she broke into her father's office. She stole the documents he'd been collecting, documents that proved the conspiracy went all the way to the top of the territorial government. The pieces clicked into place for Thadwick. She hadn't ended up in Whispering Pines by accident. She'd been running, yes, but she'd also been hunting. For 3 long, brutal years, she'd been gathering evidence against Judge Fans, using her position as a helpless saloon girl to observe his entire operation from the inside. The contract Fans held over her wasn't about money or service. It was insurance. As long as he thought he controlled her, as long as he saw her as a broken, terrified woman, she was invisible, she was safe. And if she ever tried to run, he'd have her arrested for the very crime she had committed back in Silverdale: theft of territorial documents. He had her trapped perfectly, or so he thought. She reached into the bodice of her thin dress and pulled out a small brass key. "This opens a safety deposit box at the bank," she said, pressing it into his palm. "It has copies of everything: financial records, forged deeds, witness statements from other women, everything you need to destroy him." She had reached a dead end. Fans was too powerful. He controlled the local courts, the local lawmen. The evidence she had would never see the light of day. She needed someone with power, with resources, someone who couldn't be silenced or bought, someone who could get the information to the federal authorities far beyond Fans's reach. Thadwick finally understood. She hadn't been rejecting his help earlier because she didn't trust him. She'd been protecting him, because the moment he took this key, the moment he chose to join her fight, there was no going back. Judge Fans wouldn't just try to ruin his business. He would try to bury Thadwick Ormsby so deep no one would ever find the body. Thadwick had built his fortune on calculated risks, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this. He closed his fingers around the key. The metal was warm from her skin. It felt as heavy as a stick of dynamite. As their fingers brushed, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just fear or defiance or determination. It was something deeper. Recognition. She was looking at him like she'd seen him before, somewhere other than this saloon. And suddenly, Thadwick felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December wind rattling the windows. Thadwick's mind was racing. "We need to get to that safety deposit box. Now, before the meeting with Fans." He started to stand, but she grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Wait," she said, her voice urgent. "There's something else. The most important part." She leaned even closer, her eyes searching his face. "Your name isn't really Thadwick Ormsby, is it?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He froze. 30 years ago," she continued, her voice barely a whisper, "in a town called Broken Creek, there was a boy named Thomas Ormsby. His family, his mother, his father, his little sister, they were all killed in what the official report called an Apache raid." She paused. "The boy Thomas disappeared that same night. They never found his body. He was just gone." Thadwick's hand moved on its own, a reflex 30 years old, to the faint scar hidden beneath the collar of his shirt. The scar, he told people, was from a horse accident when he was a kid. The scar that was actually from the tip of a knife, held by a man who thought he was silencing a 10-year-old witness for good. She saw the movement. She saw the recognition dawning in his eyes, and she pressed on. "Judge Fans," she said, and her words were like stones dropping into a deep well, "was the young territorial prosecutor who handled the Broken Creek case. He was the one who ruled the deaths were the result of a random raid, despite evidence to the contrary. He was the one who closed the case in 3 days. He was the one who was paid a very large sum of money to cover up what really happened to the Ormsby family." The saloon started to spin. The faces of the other patrons blurred into a meaningless watercolor. For 30 years, he had built his life on a foundation of that one terrible memory. A random, senseless act of violence. He had survived it. He had become strong, rich, powerful, all to ensure that nothing like that could ever happen to him again. But if she was right, if fans had covered up his family's murder, then his entire life was a lie. Verdella reached into her dress again. This time, she pulled out a photograph, its edges soft and yellowed with age. It showed a man and a woman, their faces proud and hopeful, standing next to a young boy with Thadwick's eyes. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, Thomas Ormsby, age 10, Broken Creek, 1851. He stared at the face of the boy he used to be, and the dam he had built in his mind broke. 30 years of buried memories came flooding back in a torrent of sound and terror. Night riders, their faces hidden by bandanas, the smell of kerosene and smoke, his mother's scream, cut short, his father's last words to him, a desperate whisper as he shoved him into the root cellar. Don't come out. No matter what you hear, don't you come out. And most vivid of all, a voice. A man's voice, low and gravelly, giving the orders, a voice he'd heard just minutes ago, right here in this saloon. The same voice that belonged to the scarred man, Silas. Your family wasn't killed for their land, Verdella whispered, seeing the horror on his face. They were killed because your father discovered something. He'd found proof of Fans's early corruption schemes, and he was going to expose him. Fans murdered an entire family to keep his secret. 30 years of carefully controlled rage, of grief buried so deep he thought it was gone, erupted inside him. All this time, he had been living in the same territory, breathing the same air as the men who had destroyed his childhood, who had turned him into an orphan, who had stolen everything he had ever loved. He looked at Verdella, at this impossible woman, with new eyes. She hadn't just been investigating Fans's current crimes. She had been digging into his entire rotten history. She had connected her own tragedy to his. Just as this earth-shattering revelation settled over him, Yule Clevenger appeared at their table. He was carrying a fresh bottle of whiskey and 2 clean glasses. His smile was too wide, too forced. His hands were shaking worse than Roxana's had been. On the house, Mr. Ormsby, Clevenger stammered, a gesture of goodwill before your important meeting tonight. He set the glasses down. Thadwick, his mind still reeling, numbly reached for his glass. As he lifted it to his lips, Verdella's hand shot out like a snake, knocking the glass from his grasp. Whiskey splashed across the table. And in the spreading amber puddle, glinting in the lamplight, Thadwick saw them, tiny, unmistakable white crystals dissolving in the alcohol. Clevenger's face turned the color of ash. He knew he was caught, and Thadwick understood. Judge Fans wasn't waiting for the meeting at the courthouse. The corruption in Whispering Pines ran so deep that even the town's pathetic bootlicking bartender was willing to commit murder to protect it. When the hunter becomes the hunted, survival depends on who strikes first. Clevenger stumbled backward, his chair crashing to the floor as Thadwick rose from his seat, his eyes blazing with a fury 30 years in the making. The bartender's face had gone from nervous to pure terror in the space of a heartbeat. It's just sugar, Clevenger stammered, his words tripping over each other. For the taste, to make the drink special for an important customer like yourself. But Thadwick had seen those same crystals before, years ago, in a rough mining camp, when a group of claim jumpers had tried to poison a rival prospector. Arsenic. Not enough to kill, not right away. Just enough to make a man sick, disoriented, weak. Just enough to make sure that when Thomas Ormsby walked into Judge Fans's courthouse tonight, he'd be at a severe and fatal disadvantage. Thadwick moved faster than Clevenger could react. He grabbed the front of the bartender's shirt, twisting the fabric in his fist, and pulled him so close their faces were inches apart. His voice was a deadly, quiet hiss. "How long, Clevenger? How long have you been his rat? How many other people have you served a special drink to?" The confession came tumbling out in a pathetic, blubbering torrent. He'd been reporting to fans for years, ever since the judge had helped him with some legal trouble of his own. Every stranger who came into the saloon, everyone who asked too many questions, everyone who seemed like they might cause a problem for the judge's business, Clevenger was his eyes and ears. But this was the first time, he swore it, the first time fans had ever asked him to actually poison a man. "I was scared," he cried. "He'd ruin me. He'd kill me. I was just following orders." Verdella stood up from the table. From somewhere in the folds of her dress, a small silver derringer had appeared in her hand. She held it with a steady, practiced calm. "Being scared isn't an excuse for attempted murder," she said, her voice like ice. "You need to decide, right now, whose side you're really on." The few remaining patrons were now on their feet. Some scrambled for the doors, wanting no part of this. Others watched, their faces a mixture of fear and a morbid curiosity born from living in a town where violence was just another part of the weather. Thadwick knew they had to get out of there, immediately. If Fans was willing to try poisoning him in a public saloon, there was no telling what else he had planned. He turned toward the front doors, but Verdella grabbed his arm, shaking her head sharply. She pointed toward the saloon's grimy front window. Through the swirling snow, he could just make out the dark shapes of 3 figures on horseback, positioned across the street. Fans's men, Silas and the others. They weren't just waiting for news. They were an anvil, waiting for the hammer to fall, waiting for a sick, stumbling Thadwick Ormsby to emerge from the saloon, easy prey for whatever came next. The front was blocked. The whole town was a trap. Verdella pulled him toward the back of the saloon, toward a door marked Private. Thadwick had assumed it was a storage closet, but when she opened it, he saw a narrow, steep staircase leading down into darkness. "The saloon was built over the old mining tunnels," she explained as they plunged into the cold, musty air below. "During the silver boom, prospectors dug this whole part of town up. Most of the tunnels are collapsed, but some of them still connect." The basement was a labyrinth of stone and damp earth, with dark passages branching off in every direction. Verdella moved through the gloom with a confidence that told him she'd been down here many times before. She knew these tunnels. She had planned for this. She led him down a passage she said would come out in the cellar of the general store, 3 buildings down the street. But as they hurried through the darkness, Thadwick heard a sound from behind them. Footsteps, scrabbling on the stone. Clevenger had followed them down, and he wasn't alone. From the sound of the boots echoing in the confined space, at least 3 or 4 of Fans's men were with him. Verdella pulled out her derringer. He heard the click as she checked the chambers. 2 shots, not enough. Thadwick drew his Colt, .45, the familiar weight a small comfort in the suffocating darkness. But in a narrow tunnel, against unknown numbers, even the best gunfighter was just a man waiting to die. They reached a fork in the tunnel. For the first time, Verdella hesitated. "The left passage goes to the general store," she whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. "But it's the long way. It passes under 2 other buildings, more chances for them to cut us off." She pointed to the right. "That one is shorter. It leads directly to the bank's basement, but it's a dead end. If they trap us in there, there's no way out." Thadwick could hear their pursuers getting closer. He could hear Silas's low, gravelly voice calling out orders. They would be at the fork in less than a minute. He made the decision. "Right," he said, "to the bank." If they were going to make a stand, it would be there, with the evidence, with his father's last words. If they didn't make it out, at least the truth would be waiting for whoever found their bodies. As they plunged into the right-hand tunnel, a chilling thought struck Thadwick. The poison, the men outside. Clevenger's betrayal, even these tunnels. Fans hadn't just reacted to him. He'd been preparing for this, for him. What he didn't know was that Judge Fans had been waiting 30 long years for the boy who escaped Broken Creek to finally come home. And now that Thomas Ormsby had returned, the judge was prepared to finish the job he'd started all those decades ago. The tunnel ended at a heavy, iron-banded wooden door. Verdella produced another key from her dress, this one smaller, older. She'd clearly had this escape route planned down to the last detail. The lock clicked open and they slipped inside, barring the door behind them, just as the first of their pursuers reached the end of the passage. Fists began to hammer on the wood. They were in the bank's basement, a cavernous space filled with filing cabinets, old furniture, and locked strongboxes. Above them, Thadwick could hear the muffled, mundane sounds of the town's daily business, the clink of coins, the murmur of conversations, the rhythmic stamp of a clerk's seal. A normal world floating just a few feet above their desperate reality. The hammering on the door grew more frantic. They didn't have much time. Verdella led him past rows of shelves to a small brick-lined room with a grated iron door. The safety deposit vault. She unlocked it and they went inside. The air was cool and dry, smelling of paper and metal. "Box 47, she whispered, scanning the wall of small, numbered brass doors. She found it near the back, partially hidden by a stone support pillar. As she inserted the key she'd given him in the saloon, Thadwick took up a position, watching both the basement door and the wooden staircase that led up to the main bank floor. His Colt felt slick with sweat in his hand. The small door swung open. Inside was a worn leather portfolio, tied shut with a leather thong. Verdella pulled it out and laid it on a small wooden table. Her fingers, steady now, untied the knot. She opened the portfolio, and Thadwick saw the culmination of 3 years of her life. 3 years of living in the shadows, of enduring humiliation and fear, all for this moment. There were financial ledgers, showing in meticulous detail how Judge Fans had siphoned money and land from dozens of families. There were forged death certificates used to seize the property of men who had died in convenient accidents. There were sworn, signed statements from other women Fans had trapped with his contracts, detailing the blackmail, the abuse, the terror. And at the very bottom of the stack, there was a single, folded letter. The paper was brittle with age. Thadwick recognized the handwriting immediately. It was his father's. It was dated just 2 days before the massacre at Broken Creek. It was addressed to the territorial governor, and it laid out in clear, damning detail the evidence his father had uncovered about Fans's corruption, formally requesting a federal investigation. His father hadn't been a fool. He hadn't been careless. He had been trying to use the law to do things the right way. And for that, Fans had decided murder was the simpler solution. A loud crash echoed from the basement. They'd broken through the tunnel door. At the same moment, footsteps pounded down the wooden stairs from the main bank floor above. They were coming from both directions. Verdella quickly stuffed the documents back into the portfolio and thrust it into Thadwick's hands. "There's one more tunnel," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "Behind a false wall, back in the storage room. It leads under the street to the church. From there." But as they moved toward the vault door, a voice boomed down the staircase from above. A voice of absolute authority. A voice of pure, unadulterated evil. It was Judge Fans. "Lock it down, Mr. Abernathy," the judge commanded the bank manager. "The entire building. No one in, no one out. We have a security situation that requires my personal attention." They were trapped, sealed in. Fans's men were flooding the basement from the tunnels. The main floor was now an armed camp. The hidden tunnel to the church was their only hope, but it would take precious time they didn't have to find and open it. That's when Verdella made a decision that hit Thadwick harder than any bullet could have. She stood in front of him, blocking his path. "You go," she said, her green eyes locked on his. Take the portfolio. I'll stay. I'll create a distraction. Buy you the time you need to get away with the evidence. Her voice was resolute. My mission, for 3 years, has been to get this information to someone who could use it. That's you, Thomas. It's always been you. No, he said, the word raw. I'm not leaving you. We face this together. He wouldn't lose someone else to this monster. Not again. But her answer revealed a layer of planning, of cold, hard strategy that left him breathless. He thinks he's trapped me, she said, a flicker of a grim smile on her lips. But it's the other way around. She looked him straight in the eye. 2 weeks ago, I sent copies of the most damaging documents, including your father's letter, to a trusted friend, a federal marshal in Denver, with a letter of my own. It instructed him that if he didn't hear from me by a certain date, or if he received word of my death or disappearance under suspicious circumstances, he was to open the package and deliver it directly to the territorial governor and the Department of Justice. She had been prepared for this exact moment from the very beginning. Her helplessness, her vulnerability, her fear. It had all been a mask, a carefully constructed role she played to perfection, luring the spider out of his web. Thadwick stared at her, not with shock, but with awe. Verdella Corwin wasn't just a victim seeking revenge. She was a master strategist who had spent 3 years setting the perfect trap for the man who had destroyed her life. But Judge Fans had been playing this game for 30 years, and as his voice echoed from the bottom of the stairs, closer now, Thadwick knew that all of Verdella's brilliant planning might not be enough to save them from a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of making his enemies disappear. The sound of splintering wood exploded through the basement as Fans's men found the hidden door to the church tunnel. They had minutes, maybe less. The final confrontation was here, and it would decide whether Whispering Pines would finally be free, or whether 2 more names would be added to the judge's long, silent list of victims. Sometimes, justice comes at a price that changes everyone who pays it. The hidden door behind the false wall was a section of stone shelving that swung inward, revealing a tunnel barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through. It was an old smuggler's route, tight and claustrophobic. Thadwick pushed Verdella in ahead of him and followed, the leather portfolio clutched against his chest. Behind them, he could hear the triumphant shouts as Fans's men broke into the bank basement. 30 years of secrets, 3 years of evidence. All of it would either save this town or die with them in the suffocating darkness beneath it. They had only scrambled 50 feet down the narrow passage when Verdella suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. "Listen," she breathed. Thadwick held his breath, and he heard it, ahead of them, muffled voices, the scuff of a boot on stone. They were waiting for them. Fans had anticipated this route too. He hadn't just guarded the main exits. He'd plugged every bolt hole, every secret passage. He had turned the entire underground network into a perfectly designed kill box. A wave of cold despair washed over Thadwick. Fans's corruption wasn't just deep, it was total. In his 30 years of rule, he had learned every secret of Whispering Pines, every weakness, every escape route. They were surrounded, below ground, above ground, behind them, and now in front of them. Judge Fans had finally, definitively, cornered the last survivor of the Broken Creek massacre. But Verdella Corwin had one final card to play, one desperate, last-ditch gamble. She looked up. "There's a shaft," she whispered, her voice tight with tension. "Right here. It was for ventilation when they first dug these tunnels. It goes straight up." She looked at Thadwick, her eyes gleaming in the faint light filtering from a grate above. "It's dangerous, probably unstable, but it's the one way out he won't be expecting." Thadwick followed her gaze. High above them, a vertical shaft disappeared into absolute blackness. He could just make out the outlines of rusted iron rungs embedded in the stone walls. Some of them had clearly broken away, leaving treacherous gaps. It was a suicide climb, but suicide was better than slaughter. Desperation was all they had left. "Go," he said. Verdella went first, moving with a wiry strength he hadn't known she possessed. She tested each rung before trusting it with her weight. Thadwick followed right behind her, the portfolio now tucked securely inside his coat, his Colt in his hand. Far above, a tiny, faint circle of gray light marked the exit. They were 20 feet up, the air growing colder, when Judge Fans's voice echoed up the shaft from the tunnel below. He had found their entry point. His voice, amplified by the confined space, was clear and mocking, and what he said froze Thadwick's blood. "Thomas!" the judge called out, his voice dripping with triumphant venom. "Thomas Ormsby! I have to admit I'm impressed. You've been more trouble than I expected." He knew. He'd known all along. "I've been waiting 30 years for this reunion, boy," Fans continued, his voice echoing around them like the devil's own sermon. "I always knew you'd surface eventually. A weed like you always grows back. Your father, he was a fool. A self-righteous, arrogant fool who thought his silly laws mattered more than progress. More than power. The Broken Creek business was a necessity, Thomas. A regrettable but necessary act to protect a system that keeps the peace and makes important men wealthy." A rung under Thadwick's boot groaned and shifted. He pressed himself against the cold, damp stone, his heart hammering against his ribs. Fans's voice rose, filled with a chilling glee. "But your survival. That was an unexpected gift. For 30 years, I've had to live with that one loose end, that one piece of unfinished business. Now finally, I have the chance to finish what I started." They scrambled the last few feet and hauled themselves over the edge, collapsing onto a dusty wooden floor. They were in a small, abandoned mining shed, choked with the smell of rotting timber and rust. Through cracks in the walls, they could see they were on the snowy outskirts of town, near the old, played-out mining district. But their desperate escape had cost them dearly. Below, they could hear the clanging sound of Fans's men beginning to climb the rungs of the shaft. And outside the shed, more voices, shouts, the crunch of boots in the snow. Fans had positioned men up here as well. The shed was surrounded. This was it, the end of the line. Thadwick made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He shoved the portfolio into Verdella's hands. "Run," he ordered, his voice raw. "Get this to the marshal. I'll hold them off. I'll buy you the time." She didn't even hesitate. "No," she said, her voice fierce, unyielding. "We came this far together. We finish it together." She raised the small Derringer, its 2 shots a pitiful defense against an army. "If he's going to win, he'll have to kill us both to do it." With a deafening crash, the shed door burst open, ripped from its hinges. Judge Fans himself stood there, silhouetted against the gray, snowy light. He was flanked by the scarred man, Silas, and 2 other hard-faced gunmen. The judge was older than Thadwick expected, a man whose evil was cloaked in fine wool and respectability. But his eyes were ancient and cold, holding the flat reptilian calculation of a man who had orchestrated decades of murder and called it business. He looked at Thadwick, and a slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. "30 years ago," the judge said calmly, "I made the mistake of assuming a 10-year-old boy was dead." He raised a pistol, its barrel a black, unblinking eye. "Tonight, I will not make the same error." But what Judge Fans didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Verdella Corwin had been telling the absolute truth about the federal marshal in Denver. And at that exact moment, hundreds of miles away, a telegraph key was clicking, sending a message that would bring the full weight of the United States government down on this forgotten corner of Montana. The confrontation in that abandoned mining shed lasted less than 5 minutes. It was a blur of motion and sound, of desperate courage against overwhelming odds. When the gun smoke finally cleared and the sudden, ringing silence fell, Judge Fan's 30-year reign of terror was over. But the cost of justice had been higher than either Thadwick or Verdella could have anticipated. Whispering Pines would eventually heal. The town, free from the cancer of Fan's corruption, slowly came back to life. New leaders emerged, honest men and women who believed in the law, not in twisting it. Honest businesses flourished, and the women who had been trapped by the judge's fraudulent contracts, their lives stolen from them, were finally, blessedly free. Thadwick Ormsby returned to his ranch on the edge of town, but he was no longer the same man who had walked into Clevenger's saloon on that snowy December day. He had reclaimed his true name, his true past. He was Thomas Ormsby, the boy who survived Broken Creek, and he had finally found the justice his family had been denied for 3 long decades. And Verdella Corwin, the woman they had all called Roxana, finally stepped out of the shadows she had been forced to inhabit for 3 years. With the evidence from the portfolio, she became the special prosecutor who methodically dismantled what was left of Fan's network, cleaning up the town's legal system from the inside out, ensuring that no one would ever have to suffer the way she and Thomas had. Sometimes, the greatest acts of courage come from the most unlikely people, hiding in the most desperate of places. And sometimes, when justice finally arrives, it transforms not just the guilty who are brought down, but the innocent who fought, against all odds, to see it done. If you were Thadwick, would you have risked everything to help a stranger, or would you have walked away from trouble that wasn't yours? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of courage, redemption, and justice from America's wild frontier, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We bring you a new story every single day, and you won't want to miss what we have in store for you tomorrow.